Chris, do you want to introduce who you are and how you ended up on this event, on this webcast? And then I'll introduce myself for folks that don't know me, and we'll get started.
Yeah. So I am obsessed with how people grow and develop as leaders. Our company works with people literally all over the world, helping them develop. We tend to work with team leaders, business owners, CEOs, founders, and then throughout the executive level of leaders. And Daniel and I, last year, as kind of dominoes fell, came to a place that we wanted to share a mission together. And his gift for putting things to words brought us to a place where we had just a really clear call to action. Emergent, it's where everyone gets to grow. So just excited to be here today to help people in a moment that is a lot of uncertainty on how to grow. You and I have been through those moments. Everybody has been. My work came out of the last economic crisis in 2008. And I went from plus $1 million to negative six figures of debt. And all the crisis that came around that. Had to rebuild my life economically, even rebuild my mindset. And so that's what we get to do now. And here we are in tough territory again as a group.
Yeah. Thank you. So for those that don't know me, my name is Daniel Jude. I work in the employee engagement, diversity, inclusion, and leadership development space. So where all those things kind of touch and intersect. So thinking about things like creating inclusive spaces, organizational culture, authentic relationship development, lots of that kind of stuff. So I do that just on my own, and met Chris last year. And like he said, it was sort of a 1 + 1 = 100 kind of moment. And we just realized the work that each of us was doing married the work of the other really, really well, complemented it really well. And so last year we started an organization called EMERGENT, which, as Chris mentioned, our sort of tagline is everyone gets to grow. So making sure we're providing world-class development opportunities to everybody, regardless of title or organization or budget or whatever. Want to make sure that everybody gets the opportunity to keep leveling up. So Chris and I are a part of that together, and wanted to have an opportunity to reflect a lot of the conversations that we were having with business leaders, from individual contributors all the way up to the C-suite, during this season of deep uncertainty, lots of fear, lots of anxiety. So we wanted to serve the communities that we're a part of, and that's where this event was born. So Chris is going to get started on our content, but I wanted to give a quick agenda for where we're going today, to make sure people feel comfortable with that, and a little disclaimer as we get going. So general agenda, Chris and I are going to introduce a paradigm or framework for thinking about how to be in a space of fear and anxiety and transition out of that. If you remember the graphic that we're using as a frame for this event, it's got a circle for fear, and then we move out of that into learning, and then we move out of that into growth. And so that's the framework that we're using for this event. But what we didn't want to do was to communicate that fear makes you less than, or that fear is somehow bad or evil or weak. So you won't hear us saying those things. We want to be crystal clear that this event is in response to conversations that we've had where people are being asked to juggle lots of new things in lots of uncertain contexts. But it's not a pill that you're supposed to swallow to make you not afraid anymore. It's not a silver bullet to say we found the solutions for all of your problems. And it's not a commentary that if you are afraid of in this season or have anxiety in this season, that you're somehow less than we are and we have figured out a solution where we no longer experience anxiety. That's not what's happening. That's not what we want to communicate to you. Some of us are annoyed at having to work from home, and we can't focus, and that's creating anxiety for us. Some of us may have lost a loved one or have a family member who is ill right now. Those are different things. And this reality is showing up differently for different people. And we want you to hear from us as we start, that we're not saying not only that all fear is not bad, but also just a concession that it looks and feels different for everybody depending on what the situation is. And so we just want to kind of blanket and protectively wrap our conversation in that before we get going. So that's the space that we all get to relax into, knowing that all of our experiences are valid and important, and that they're happening differently for each one of us. So fear is real, and that's where we want to start. We want to start thinking about this kind of zone of what's called the fear zone, I guess. And we want to make sure before we try to move into learning or growth that we create some space to affirm what is happening in this fear zone and not to pretend it's not happening. So, Chris, I would love for you to jump off there and help us start understanding what do we mean when we say fear, what's happening, and maybe what's the problem by just calling it fear, period, and moving on.
Yeah, it's so hard when you get that fear response to actually distinguish between what's a real fear and what's a perceived fear. So one of the places that I start with this work myself, and I've had to walk myself through this a number of times these last 6, 7, 8 crazy weeks, is I think about it like, being way back as humans. We're in the cave and we're sitting around the fire, and we're taken care of, we're in community, and then there's a saber-toothed tiger noise. And you hear that saber-toothed tiger noise, and literally your nervous system is conditioned to respond to that and go, oh, that's a threat. I need to be appropriately afraid of that threat and kick into gear. Even though I've had 40 nights of warmth and food and community around this fire. Now, the hard part about like modern living, especially in a first world context, in a working, in a world where we're, working in a place of relative safety, is that we've had to train our brains the last few decades, those that have done this work, to understand, hey, a lot of what I'm afraid of isn't real, right? Your boss might text or call or email and say, hey, we need to chat. And it runs away in your brain and you're like, oh my gosh, this is it. And then they talk to you and she might say, hey, I really want to get your opinion on this. And all of a sudden, all of that energy, all of that angst, all of that fear, all that struggle was a waste. So the message, the last few years especially, has been, hey, a lot of what you're afraid of isn't real. You've had 40 nights in your home of food, of warmth, and these things that run away in your mind that keep you awake at 2 a.m. It's not real. And now collectively, we're back into a place where you've spent 40 nights in your house, you've been warm, you've slept in a bed, and the saber-toothed tiger noise, COVID-19, now you've got this real threat to deal with. And so separating what is a real legitimate fear from a perceived fear requires some understanding and effort that works against our immediate response at the level of our nervous system. It's one thing for me to have my children disappointed in milestones they're not able to be a part of right now, and me to be afraid that I'm failing them as a dad because I can't, conjure that up for them. So there's the real fear of how this affects them, and there's the perceived fear that's false that, oh, I'm doing a bad job as a dad right now. I'm doing a bad job as a mom right now because I can't make sure they don't experience this. So if we start there, then we can start to parse these apart. What does that bring up for you, Daniel?
Yeah, your example of, my children not getting to participate in some like landmark events is a real fear or anxiety or stressor. But it doesn't mean I'm failing as a dad. That's the perceived fear. So that's just bringing up examples. For me, I was writing some down earlier, thinking about, a real fear for me. Oh, it's hard to get the exact groceries that I want at the exact moment I want them sometimes. That's a real fear or anxiety or stressor. A perceived fear would be, we're all going to starve. That's not the reality right now. And if I let my mind take me to that place, I'm living in a perceived future that may or may not ever exist. And it's easy to let our minds run away with that. So I like the idea of thinking about real versus perceived. Fear isn't bad, but perceived fears just aren't helpful, right? True fear is asking me to pay attention to certain kinds of things. So for me, it's this spectrum, right? And I know you and I were talking about this earlier, where I think a lot of us are afraid of a lot of things, have lots of anxiety. And what we want to communicate is that doesn't mean you're weak. Having fear doesn't mean you're weak. On the other end of that spectrum, there are some that aren't afraid or don't think they're afraid of anything, that aren't experiencing fear. And what we want to say is that doesn't make you strong. Having fear doesn't make you weak. Not feeling fear doesn't make you strong. What we're looking for, and the first stage of this growth journey that we want folks to be on, or that we want to present, is to acknowledge the tension between the two, right? Phase number one is acknowledge the tension, that I want to live in this sort of messy middle of some fear is good. It helps point my attention to what's important and what I need to be looking at. Too much fear isn't good. And it's not about being strong or weak. It's about really diving into what is my true, real fear here. And if it's grounded and rational, I want to pay attention to it. And we'll talk about what to do with that in a moment. But if it's not rational, if it's not grounded, I get to sort of set that aside and say, that's not helpful to me. It doesn't serve me. And it may not even be real. So I guess the question as we end this first stage, or move on to the second stage, Chris, as we close this one, is how do I know what's a real fear versus a perceived fear? Do they look different? Do they feel different? Do they make me do different things? Like, what's my metric for knowing that, if I'm using the answer to that metric to kind of move me out of the fear zone into the learning zone?
Yeah, I love that. And that question takes me right to toilet paper. If you would have told me like 4 months ago, hey, Chris, there's going to be a Saturday where you're going to worry that you got an order in quick enough. And if you don't get it in quick enough, you're not going to get enough toilet paper to your house. And you're going to obsess over that mentally for a minute or longer. Then I would have said to you, there is no way that is not happening. There's no way that's happening. Because this real fear versus this perceived fear, I'm getting on and I'm trying to order it and it's running out. I'm trying to hurry my wife up. Hey, we got to place this order. We're missing these delivery times. And then I'm walking around a little angsty, and it's just insane. And here is the biggest idea. This is the starting point to emerging out of the fear zone. It's acknowledging there's a paradox to this reality. There's a tension. There's a both and. And what our brains want is very black-white binary thinking. Saber-toothed tiger noise, run. Not a saber-toothed tiger. It doesn't matter. And the problem with that is, like right now, some of you might be afraid that what's going to happen in the economy? What's going to happen to my job? Am I going to be furloughed? Have I been furloughed? Am I going to have to look for new work? And there's the real fear that economic provision matters, money matters, your job matters, and the perceived fear that you're in this alone, that no one will be there for you, that your family will be let down by you, that they will think that you are less than because of this moment. And so when you can step into the tension and the paradox and go, this hurts and this feels real, and I'm worried about the job, but I don't have to be worried and obsessed with what people think of me. That's where we start to really live out of our higher mind, the human brain. It's getting beyond the mammalian response. And that's where we start to find our opportunity to get peace in the paradox and the tension. And once we find peace in the paradox, we can proceed out of the fear zone.
I love it. We're allowed to be afraid of losing a job, but we don't have to be afraid of what people will think of us if we do, right? That's something that we're creating. That's good. Yeah. So step one, obviously we're just kind of cruising at the 30,000 foot view level. And as soon as this meeting is over, in 5 or 10 minutes, you'll get an email from me through my MailChimp account. So make sure MailChimp doesn't go to your spam, I guess. But you'll get an email from me with a bunch of follow-up resources, free webinar, free sort of leadership assessment tool, all kinds of stuff to help you figure out how to make sense of this at a more granular level. But 30,000 foot view, first thing we got to do to move out of fear into growth is acknowledge the tension of fear, that some of it is real and some of it is made up, perceived. Second stage is accept the terms of reality, right? We have to, if we're accepting that some fear is real, we have to accept that reality, accept the terms, the accountability, the weight of that reality. And for me, that's kind of a twofold acceptance for me. The first thing I think about when I think about accepting that is that I know that there are patterns that are unfolding around me that bring my focus to areas that need my attention. So some things that I thought about for myself, after watching the news, I tend to fill in the blank. That's a pattern, right? Before an important online meeting, I tend to, and then fill in the blank. Trying to help my kids with school makes me feel a certain kind of way, right? And there are patterns there. Navigating isolation versus community in my neighborhood is challenging, and there are patterns that develop. So the first thing about accepting the terms for me is like noticing patterns that exist and that are happening as this experience unfolds. Chris, you talk a lot about the windshield of our lives, noticing what's happening as if it's happening through a windshield. So kind of reserving judgment about it until after we've noticed all of the things. And so accepting the terms is seeing all these patterns develop. And the second thing for me about accepting the terms or doing something with these patterns is then accepting the fact that I'm an actor, not just an observer in my experiences, right? That all these patterns are happening, and then there are actions that I participate in or don't that perpetuates them or stops them or interrupts them. And I get to choose what those things are, but those are decisions, right? I got to make decisions, and there's accountability whenever we make decisions. That's leadership 101, right? Decisions equal accountability. So if we're accepting these terms and paying attention to patterns and all of that kind of stuff, what do you do with that, Chris? Where do you take that, and sort of how do we accept responsibility as we make decisions, noticing fear, trying to separate perceived from real, seeing patterns in our lives that are kind of unfolding in new ways? How do we accept responsibility for decisions we're making, or what does that weight feel like?
Yeah. I'll tell you how it doesn't happen. You don't get there by going, well, all fear is an illusion. If a tornado was coming at your house right now, you would appropriately act. And the problem with so much of modern existence is, everything has this elevated response to it. So once we live in the paradox, we're not passively going, all right, well, so I'm furloughed. I'm not worth less because I'm furloughed, or I'm not worth less because I lost my job. And because of that, I'm just going to, enjoy this little sanctuary of a moment. Who cares what's in the bank account? If anybody talked or thought like that, you would say, hey, come on, buddy, wake up. Okay, get here with me now. And the way that we do that is we understand that, life and so many of the variables that we think matter so much, it is like a game. And I don't mean to trivialize pain, but if any of you saw the It's a Beautiful Life movie, the guy is in the Nazi prison camp with his son, and he doesn't want it to traumatize his son too much. So he convinces his son he's in a game, and they do this point system. And at one point, he's pulling up his shirt and going, belly button, and having a lot of fun to communicate that to him. Weirdly, some friends did a drive-by this past weekend to say hey and yell at us and go, woo. So all my daughters were at the door, and I ran over to the door, and they're yards away in the street. And I did that. I was like, belly button, just to try to bring some levity to this. But here's what I know. I know that right now, so many of you that are participating and engaging and watching this are caught in it's like you're butting your head up against the wall. There's some kind of pattern that you're not quite unblocking or cracking that code. And I think about it like algebra. Any of you watching this right now, I think you would share my emotion. I wasn't like, yay, algebra, I love this. All the unknowns, all the variables. And I still remember, like, in the 7th grade, 6th grade, whatever it was, having to learn algebra just like step by step, so incrementally. And the teacher would write on that little thing, and she'd wipe off the marker and write some more. And you right now are in an algebra moment. I'm in an algebra moment. Here's what I mean. You learn algebra faster, the unknowns and the variables, through immersion than you do incrementally. They've shown in some studies where you can learn it over days, quicker than you can, deeper than you can over months or a year. All of us right now have been immersed in a new reality of thinking weird things about our groceries and survival and all of these struggles. And when we really absorb that, and we really know that, and we really own that, then what we get to do is start, like learning algebra, learn the patterns. Learn the patterns. You know, there are things in your life that are playing out right now that have played out before in some way. COVID just makes it more intense. You know, for me, 2008, losing an income, going from +7 figures to -6. How do I rebuild my life? How do I rebuild my finances? What's it look like to take care of myself in this craziness? And I think for those of you that are watching that, taking care of yourself is a place that the responsibility, the accepting of it starts, and that's great. But that's not the finishing work here. Because if you think about this like this tornado that's coming at your house, like Daniel asked, how do you accept responsibility? You've also got to learn to make meaning for yourself more than ever before. Because if you can't make meaning for yourself, you're going to lose some motivation in learning these patterns. You know, we want to learn how to move from the fear zone to the growth zone, from fear to future. We want to be fast, effective learners. Well, how can we learn as fast and effectively as possible? We're immersed in it, and we start paying attention to the patterns. This game is being played out, and let's learn those rules around us as quick as we can. And when we do that, we understand that we're not off the hook. So if we're not off the hook, Daniel, how do we live this out in a way of street level, small actions that make a big difference?
Yeah, well, I think for me, your question kind of answers itself. Small street level action, right? So because you and I are both a little bit crazy, attracted to language and love the way that it works, we made everything start with the same letter, which is a real problem that I have.
We're addicted.
But our third phase is we called acting on the triggers. Right? We acknowledge the tension, we accept the terms, now we act on the triggers. And so taking responsibility and being in a space of tension and thinking about fear and what that looks like, identifying patterns and recognizing that the things that are stressing us now are the same things that were stressing us before, but maybe in this season they've just been exacerbated, but that we've got all of these patterns that do and don't serve us, do and don't move us forward. Then we act, right? We shrink down what helps us move forward or interrupt unhelpful or unhealthy patterns. It's Wednesday at noon in the Midwest, so we've got some tornado sirens. That's a pattern that we could have expected doing a Zoom call at noon.
And we're acknowledging the tension.
Look at us go. Woo.
And I acted on the trigger and shut the office window really quick. Baller.
So what I want to pause on before I ask you to talk a little bit more about shrinking or acting on these triggers and thinking about shrinking actions to the smallest executionable activity is just the reality, like we started with, that everybody's showing up differently. Everybody's got different experiences. Everybody's got different expertise. Everyone has a different personality. We've got all of this diversity within our own identities and experiences across the board. And so as we think about acting on these triggers, just want to acknowledge that for some of us, having a conceptual, abstract conversation about fear, real versus perceived, and accepting the terms of decision making, this makes sense to us, and already we've got things popping in our head like, oh, I'm thinking about patterns right now, and this makes sense to me. Some of us are more concrete thinkers, not quite so abstract. And so this is still a little bit, maybe 30,000 foot view fuzzy. So just want to put it out there. In a couple of minutes, we're going to break into small groups, and you'll get a chance to actually kind of talk this out real time with some other folks who are on this call. But just want to throw that out there. For me, acting on the smallest sort of executionable action, acting on the trigger, is first, of course, acknowledging the fear is my brain or my body or my heart asking me to pay attention to something, and acting on it is about figuring out what strategy makes sense and making sure I'm not stepping into a pattern that's unhealthy or unproductive. So one of the things we're hearing about, just an example right now, that people are trying to make decisions about is debt, right? So folks have student debt or credit card debt or car debt or all kinds of stuff. And some folks are hearing, hey, you can stop paying on some of that and it won't hurt your credit score, or there will be some debt forgiveness, or you've got some extra latitude in debt repayment right now because of the pandemic. Other people are thinking, no way, my identity is tied to my credit score. I want to be an integrous part of my society. There's no way I would never not repay a loan, just even if they are going to forgive it or whatever. And so everyone's kind of aligned on this spectrum. Acting on a trigger and trying to identify, how do I make a decision based on real versus perceived fear, would be something like, I'm going to develop a strategy for debt repayment that if my income has gotten interrupted, I'm going to figure out a strategy to work with my creditors, to ask for some additional time or license or space, or maybe just a debt reduction or a plan, because I know that it's not business as usual. So I'm not going to make decisions like it's business as usual. Versus, cool, I just don't have to repay my debt. I'm going to pull all my money out of the bank. I'm going to stuff it under my mattress because the whole world's crashing and burning, right? One of those is a strategy that's stepping me into productive behaviors. And one of them is embracing perceived fear that puts me into a cycle of more fear, right? If I don't have to repay my debts, it must mean that the world's crashing and burning. If the world's crashing and burning, it must mean this. And if this means this, it must mean this. And it puts me right into this loop that continues to feed my fear. So for me, when I think about what decision do I need to make today, what's the smallest executionable, I'm not only thinking what is something I can do, I'm also thinking what's in alignment with a strategy for myself and who I think I am, that transcends this moment of fear, that is true to me and for me beyond just this moment. I don't know, Chris, how does that land for you?
Yeah, no, I think that's it, because we think of the word as trigger as bad. And trigger is just a physiological response that can be good or bad. So once we step into the paradox of something and we can start recognizing the patterns, then, hey, the tornado's coming. I'm triggered to do something good and protect. So to use your example, the financial swirling storm, I'm triggered to shut down and not pay anything, or I'm triggered to make a phone call and see if they'll work with me, which they will. I think I could frame all of this around this idea about what it was like when I was teaching my girls to play softball. Two of my three daughters played softball when they were younger. And I'm in the backyard and I'm teaching them, okay, they're going to be in a paradox of fear. They're worried when they step up to the plate. Everybody's watching me, right? Especially as they started to age. And it's just, okay, let's step into that paradox. It's not about what people think about you, but yet you want to play at your best. Both and then I would give them patterns that I knew helped them play ball better, like, hey, watch the ball, the pitch is coming, keep your eye on the ball, right? Basic stuff. Well, then when I would start to work with them about how they'd hold their swing, I'm giving small actions, small granular things that I can trigger them into that right next step. But when they went to actually go play, I told them this: your coach is the coach, and he's coached softball for years, and I knew the guy, and he had. And I said, and you know what? Your all-wise knowing Father has taught you all of this. When you go to play softball, if your coach says something in conflict with your Father, choose the coach, because I don't know as much as your coach does. And I think for wherever anybody is with what we've talked about, as you move from the fear zone to the growth zone, a world-class voice in your life can help you shrink it down to the smallest, most effective action. Just make sure you're listening to the wisdom within and the wisdom around, not the panicked voices.
Yeah, I want to give a quick example, and then we're going to break into some small groups. For me, thinking about acknowledging the tension, accepting the terms, acting on the trigger. Our third son goes to kindergarten, and when they closed school, they sent home this work packet, which was great. I was doing it with him at the kitchen table. Our third son's adopted, and based on the way that, based on his early life, he has some real difficulty doing things that are difficult or challenging or new for him with people he's also trying to build emotional relationships with, me. So we have not been super successful in doing anything academic with him. He's had much more success at school. So he goes to kindergarten, he loves it. So the first few days was great. I was working this packet with him at the kitchen table, and things are going just fine. And I'm excited. And then they realize school is going to be closed longer. So now I'm getting emails from the teachers like, well, here's the 7 apps you've got to download, and here's the websites and this, and he's got to log on for Google Chats. That's amazing that the teachers are shifting so hard, so quickly. And so none of this story is a critique of the teachers. But the tension for me was his education's really valuable and he gets to keep learning. But our and his mental health is also really important. And trying to do all this with him at home is going to be really, really challenging. And so the tension was noticing both of those sort of anxieties at work at the same time. The terms that we had to finally sort of make decisions around, what is the reality? The reality was the pattern that we experience with him is when we try to push too hard academically, it overflows into our emotional relationship, and that's not good for anybody. And we just had to, we recognized that pattern. We had to accept that reality. So acting on the trigger for us meant actually pulling him out of kindergarten and finding an online sort of a self-directed video homeschool for this last month and a half or whatever, where he sort of gets to be in charge of his learning. It's video teachers, not us. And so there's kind of a lens for his academic learning between him and us. And it's just way more helpful. And I had to let go of perceived judgment from his teachers. What are they going to think of us if we pull him out of kindergarten? And I let go a lot of stuff. But it really was this process of what's the tension, what are the what are the paradoxes, what are the patterns, and then what's the action I need to take that serves the most people. And so we made the decision, and I'm thrilled we did. It's working really well. So that's what another example of what it could look like in real time. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to hit Zoom breakouts and put y'all into sort of small group discussion rooms of 4 to 6 people, maybe it looks like. And then I'm going to broadcast a question to you. The first question will be, just so you hear it verbally, about acknowledging the tension. The first question will be, what does it look like right now for me to be exploring the tension between real and perceived fear? So for me, what does that look like? Another way of thinking about it is, am I embracing fears that might not be rational or likely? Or am I discounting fears that might be rational and likely? So what do I need to start paying attention to? After we break out, we'll pull everybody back into this and get you some resources for however moving forward makes sense for you.